In the skies over Okinawa in the spring of 1945, a Japanese kamikaze pilot pushed his aircraft into its final dive toward an American destroyer, following the exact same attack profile that had worked over and over against American anti-aircraft fire for the better part of a year. He had trained for this dive. He understood, from briefings and from the accumulated experience of the entire Tokotai program, roughly how close an American shell needed to actually strike his aircraft to bring it down. And he understood that anti-aircraft gunners firing time-fused shells at a fast-moving diving target rarely got that lucky. What he could not have known, and what Japanese intelligence would spend the rest of the war struggling to fully explain, was that the shells bursting around his aircraft that spring were no longer relying on luck at all. This is the story of the proximity fuse, one of the most closely guarded technical secrets of the entire Second World War, and how a piece of American engineering smaller than a soup can quietly turn the sky over the Pacific Fleet into a place where a near miss had suddenly become almost as deadly as a direct hit. Here is the question worth holding on to as we go. How do you explain, as a pilot or as an intelligence officer trying to brief the next wave of pilots, that the enemy's guns seem to have simply gotten better overnight, with no visible change to the guns themselves at all? It is worth appreciating just how much raw ammunition expenditure this earlier, purely probability-based approach actually required, because the scale involved illustrates exactly the kind of problem the proximity fuse was ultimately built to solve. Naval gunnery crews defending against a determined air attack might fire hundreds of shells for every aircraft actually destroyed, a ratio that, while producing results over the course of an extended engagement, placed enormous demands on ammunition supply chains, stretching back across the entire Pacific logistics network, and left ships vulnerable during the specific windows when ready ammunition ran low during a sustained, multi-wave attack of the kind kamikaze tactics, increasingly favored by the war's final year. For most of the Pacific War, American anti-aircraft gunnery, however intense in volume, operated under a fundamental mathematical limitation that both sides understood well. Conventional anti-aircraft shells relied on a time fuse, a mechanical or, later, electronic timer set before firing to detonate the shell after a specific number of seconds, calculated to correspond with where the target aircraft was predicted to be at that exact moment. This system demanded an enormous amount of precise, continuously updated calculation, tracking a target's speed, altitude, heading, and range, and it demanded that calculation be right, because a shell that detonated even a modest distance from a fast-moving aircraft did nothing at all. Against a kamikaze aircraft specifically, diving fast and often erratically toward a ship, the mathematics became even less forgiving, since the target's flight path in the final seconds of an attack run was changing constantly and violently, right up until the moment of impact or destruction. American naval gunners, for the first several years of the war, achieved kills against attacking aircraft primarily through sheer volume of fire, filling the sky with enough shells that a few, by simple probability, happened to detonate close enough to a given aircraft to bring it down. This approach worked, but it consumed enormous quantities of ammunition for every actual kill, and against the specific tactical problem the kamikaze campaign presented beginning in late 1944, sheer volume alone was proving alarmingly insufficient to stop every attacking aircraft before it reached a ship. The origins of this research trace back to a remarkable act of wartime scientific cooperation. In the summer of 1940, with Britain facing invasion and desperately outmatched in industrial capacity to develop every promising defense technology on its own, a British scientific mission traveled to the United States, carrying a black steel trunk containing some of the country's most closely guarded military secrets, including early radar technology and initial theoretical work on a proximity-fused shell, offered to American scientists in exchange for the industrial capacity the United States could bring to bear on developing these concepts into deployable weapons. This transfer, one of the more consequential moments of Anglo-American wartime scientific collaboration, gave American researchers a genuine head start on a technology that would otherwise have taken considerably longer to develop from first principles alone. The solution to this problem had actually been under secret development since before the United States even entered the war, originating from British research shared with American scientists through wartime technical cooperation, and refined at the Johns Hopkins University Applied Physics Laboratory under a security classification so tight that even many senior naval officers had only a partial understanding of exactly what the new technology involved. The device at the center of this effort, officially and deliberately misleadingly designated the VT Fuze, for variable time, was in fact something entirely different from any timer at all. A miniaturized radio transmitter and receiver, packed into the nose of an artillery shell, small enough and rugged enough to survive being fired from a naval gun at forces that would have destroyed almost any comparable radio electronics available anywhere else in the world at that time. American physicists and engineers working on the project faced a problem that had no direct precedent in prior military electronics: building a functioning radio transmitter and receiver small enough to fit within an artillery shell's nose cone, powered by a battery that had to remain inert and stable during storage and transport, but activate reliably the instant the shell was fired, all while surviving forces that would shatter almost any radio component built using conventional manufacturing techniques of the period. The project drew together some of the era's most capable young physicists and engineers, many recruited directly from academic research positions, into a compressed, urgent wartime development program that had to move from theoretical concept to mass-produced, reliably functioning battlefield hardware in a fraction of the time such an innovation would normally have required. The engineering challenge this represented is difficult to overstate. A standard artillery shell, at the moment it leaves the barrel of a naval gun, experiences acceleration forces measured in the thousands of times the force of gravity, a shock powerful enough to shatter ordinary vacuum tube radio components instantly. American scientists and engineers spent months developing specially hardened, shock-resistant vacuum tubes and a compact power supply capable of surviving that violent launch, all packed into a fuse assembly barely larger than the conventional mechanical fuses it was designed to replace. Once successfully fired, the tiny radio transmitter inside the fuse would emit a continuous signal, and the receiver would detect the strength of that signal reflecting back off any nearby object, growing stronger as the shell closed in on a target. When the reflected signal reached a specific calibrated strength, indicating the shell had come close enough to an aircraft to inflict lethal fragmentation damage even without a direct hit, the fuse detonated the shell automatically, at exactly the right instant, regardless of whether the underlying range calculation that had aimed the gun in the first place had been perfectly precise or not. Testing this technology under genuinely representative combat conditions presented its own significant challenge, since engineers needed to verify the fuse would survive actual firing forces and detonate reliably under realistic combat scenarios without being able to simply ask enemy aircraft to fly cooperative test patterns. Early testing involved extensive live-fire trials at remote proving grounds, firing production and prototype fuses against target drones and towed aerial targets to build the statistical confidence needed before committing the technology to full combat deployment, a testing regime that itself had to be conducted under the same strict secrecy governing every other aspect of the program, given the catastrophic intelligence value the technology would represent if its existence became known before it could be deployed at scale. Stop and consider what this actually solved, because the tactical implications go far beyond simply making anti-aircraft fire modestly more accurate. Every previous limitation of time-fused anti-aircraft gunnery, the need for precise range calculation, the vulnerability to a target's sudden maneuver in the final seconds, the sheer mathematical improbability of a shell detonating at exactly the right instant against a fast, erratically diving kamikaze aircraft simply stopped mattering in the same way. A proximity-fused shell did not need to arrive at a precisely calculated point in space, at a precisely calculated moment. It needed only to pass generally near the target, and the fuse itself would handle the rest, detecting the aircraft's presence directly and detonating exactly when proximity made destruction likely, transforming what had been a probability-based volume tactic into something approaching a genuinely guided kill mechanism, decades before anything resembling true guided munitions would become commonplace. The Fuze's first confirmed combat use came aboard American warships operating in the Pacific in early 1943, well before the Kamikaze campaign itself began. Initially deployed cautiously and in limited quantities as naval commanders and the scientists who had developed the technology worked through the practical challenges of manufacturing it reliably at the scale a full naval deployment would eventually require. Early combat results, even in these limited initial deployments, confirmed the dramatic improvement in effectiveness the technology's developers had predicted, validating years of secretive research the moment it was finally put to the test against real enemy aircraft rather than instrumented test drones. The security surrounding this technology reflected just how completely American commanders understood its value, and how catastrophic they judged the consequences would be if Japan or Germany managed to recover an intact, unexploded proximity fuse and reverse engineer it. For a significant period after the fuse's introduction into combat, its use was restricted specifically to engagements over open ocean, where a dud shell that failed to detonate would sink into water too deep for recovery, rather than land on territory where enemy technical intelligence teams might retrieve and study it. This restriction meant that for months, one of the most significant technical advantages the American military possessed in the entire war was deliberately held back from full deployment, even in situations where its immediate tactical value would have been considerable, purely to protect the secret of how it worked for as long as possible. The restriction against using proximity-fused shells over territory where duds might be recovered was reportedly taken seriously enough that it involved direct high-level attention from senior American political and military leadership, with concerns about premature compromise of the technology weighed carefully against the immediate tactical benefits its earlier or broader use might have provided in specific engagements. This tension between using a powerful new weapon as widely as possible to save American lives immediately and protecting its secrecy to preserve its effectiveness for the war's remaining, and potentially more critical, engagements represents exactly the kind of difficult strategic calculation that characterized several of the war's most closely guarded technical programs, echoing similar debates that surrounded other sensitive wartime innovations developed under comparable secrecy. For Japanese pilots, gunnery officers, and intelligence analysts trying to understand why American anti-aircraft fire seemed to be improving so dramatically through the final year of the war, the proximity fuse presented a problem that was almost impossible to diagnose correctly from the outside. There was no visible change to the guns themselves, no new weapon system to identify and counter, nothing an observer watching from a diving kamikaze cockpit or studying reconnaissance photographs of American ships could point to as the source of the change. What Japanese pilots and intelligence officers could observe, and what post-war accounts consistently describe, was simply a growing and deeply unsettling sense that American anti-aircraft fire had begun detonating with an accuracy that defied the mathematical logic of conventional time-fused gunnery, shells bursting close enough to inflict damage on aircraft that, by every previous understanding of how anti-aircraft timing worked, should have been able to fly through the same volume of fire, with meaningfully better odds of survival. Japan's broader wartime electronics and radio industry, strained by years of material shortages, bombing damage to industrial facilities, and a research and development base that had never matched the scale or resources devoted to comparable American programs, was in a genuinely poor position to conduct the kind of rapid, well-resourced technical investigation that correctly diagnosing the proximity fuse would have required, even setting aside the basic problem of never having recovered a clearly intact example to study directly. This structural disadvantage compounded the diagnostic problem considerably. Even had Japanese intelligence officers suspected some kind of active sensing mechanism inside American shells, verifying that suspicion and developing any kind of countermeasure would have demanded exactly the sort of well-funded, uninterrupted research capacity that Japan's wartime industrial base, by this stage of the conflict, simply no longer possessed in sufficient measure. Japanese technical intelligence services, working with the fragmentary evidence available to them, including occasional recovered shell fragments and the accumulated tactical reports from pilots who had survived encounters with the new fire pattern, appear never to have fully and correctly identified the specific mechanism behind the change before the war ended, according to post-war American intelligence assessments of what Japan actually understood at the time. Some Japanese analysis reportedly attributed the improved accuracy to simply increased volume of fire or improved human gunnery training, explanations that, while plausible on their own terms, missed the actual technical innovation entirely, a diagnostic failure that meant Japan never developed any specific countermeasure targeted at the proximity fuse's actual mechanism, because they never correctly identified that a fundamentally new mechanism was the cause at all. There is a specific and telling detail in how thoroughly this diagnostic failure persisted. Japanese pilot training materials and tactical briefings prepared for kamikaze units through the war's final months continued referencing anti-aircraft defense assumptions rooted in the older, conventional time-fused gunnery model, instructing pilots on evasive approaches, and timing calculated to exploit the known mathematical limitations of that older system. Limitations that, by the time these briefings were actually being used to prepare pilots for missions over Okinawa, no longer reflected the defensive reality those pilots would actually encounter. This meant Japanese aviators were, in a very literal sense, being trained to defeat a defensive system that had already been quietly replaced by something considerably more lethal, a gap between training doctrine and battlefield reality that widened steadily through the war's final year, without anyone in the Japanese command structure fully understanding why their own combat-tested tactical assumptions had stopped producing the survival outcomes those assumptions had once reliably predicted. This diagnostic failure carried enormous and escalating tactical consequences, precisely at the moment Japan's war effort had come to depend most heavily on the kamikaze campaign, as one of its few remaining tools capable of inflicting meaningful damage on the advancing American fleet. Pilots continued flying the same general attack profiles that had been developed and refined against the older, less lethal time-fused anti-aircraft environment. Profiles that were, by the time of the Okinawa campaign specifically, flying directly into a defensive gunnery environment that had been transformed by a technology those same pilots had no framework for understanding or evading. American commanders overseeing the fleet's air defense at Okinawa were, by this stage of the war, finally able to deploy proximity-fused ammunition across the overwhelming majority of their anti-aircraft inventory, the earlier restrictions on its use having been progressively relaxed as the technology's advantages, in an increasingly desperate defensive situation against mass kamikaze attacks, came to outweigh the diminishing marginal value of continued secrecy, particularly once enough combat use had already occurred elsewhere in the Pacific that the technology's basic existence, if not its precise mechanism, was already becoming somewhat known to Japanese forces, regardless of how carefully the earliest deployments had been controlled. The Battle of Okinawa, fought through the spring of 1945 and involving some of the largest concentrated kamikaze attacks of the entire war, became the proving ground where the proximity fuse's true tactical impact became undeniable. At exactly the moment the Tokyotai campaign had reached its largest and most desperate scale, American naval gunnery crews, now equipped with proximity-fused shells across a far larger proportion of their anti-aircraft ammunition than had been available earlier in the war, achieved kill rates against attacking Japanese aircraft that American gunnery officers themselves, comparing the results directly against earlier engagements using conventional time-fused ammunition, described as a fundamental and measurable transformation in anti-aircraft effectiveness. Some post-war naval analyses estimated that proximity-fused ammunition improved the effective kill probability per shell fired by a substantial multiple compared to conventional time fuses, a statistic that, translated into the brutal arithmetic of the Kamikaze campaign, meant significantly more attacking aircraft destroyed before reaching their targets using the same or even reduced quantities of ammunition expended. American naval crews manning the guns at Okinawa, for their part, experienced the change from the opposite side of exactly the same gap in understanding that confused Japanese pilots, though with a considerably more welcome outcome. Gunners who had spent years developing an intuitive feel for the timing and probability of conventional anti-aircraft fire found their weapons suddenly performing with a reliability that many described, in post-war accounts, as feeling almost too effective to be entirely explained by their own gunnery skill alone, a suspicion that was, in fact, entirely correct, since the technology doing much of the actual work of ensuring lethal proximity was operating silently inside the shell itself, rather than in the gunner's own aim. For the Japanese pilots flying into this transformed defensive environment, the practical experience was one of a gauntlet that seemed to have become inexplicably more lethal almost overnight, without any specific new weapon or tactic they could identify and warned subsequent waves of pilots to expect or evade. Post-war accounts from surviving Japanese aviators who flew missions during this period describe a growing, unfocused dread specifically connected to the anti-aircraft environment over the American fleet at Okinawa, a sense that survival had become measurably harder in a way none of the standard pre-mission briefings could fully explain or prepare incoming pilots for. Because the briefings themselves were working from an understanding of American gunnery that had already been quietly rendered obsolete by a piece of technology no Japanese officer had yet correctly identified. The scale of the manufacturing effort required to produce proximity fuses in the quantities the Pacific Fleet ultimately needed represented its own significant wartime achievement, requiring the establishment of dedicated, tightly secured production facilities capable of manufacturing the delicate internal electronics to exacting tolerances at a volume sufficient to supply naval gunnery crews across an enormous and expanding fleet, all while maintaining the security compartmentalization needed to keep the technology's precise workings from becoming general knowledge even among the American workers producing the components themselves. This manufacturing challenge, layered on top of the original engineering challenge of making the technology work at all, reflected the same broader pattern of American wartime industrial mobilization that had characterized so much of the Pacific War's later stages: the ability to take a sophisticated technical innovation and scale its production to genuinely decisive quantities within a remarkably compressed time frame. The proximity fuse's development and deployment remained one of the most closely guarded technical achievements of the entire American war effort. Discussed after the war by senior military and scientific figures in terms that placed it, in overall strategic significance, alongside radar and, in some assessments, even approaching the significance attributed to the atomic bomb program itself. An extraordinary claim for a piece of technology that most people who lived through the war, and many who study it today, have never heard of at all. Unlike the atomic bomb, whose existence and effects became instantly and globally known the moment it was used, the proximity fuse's impact remained, by design, almost invisible even to the American sailors whose lives it was actively saving in real time. A quiet, incremental improvement in the reliability of anti-aircraft fire that most gunners experienced simply as their guns suddenly working better, without necessarily understanding. Several of the physicists and engineers who worked on the wartime proximity fuse program went on to distinguished post-war careers in academic research, private industry, and government science policy, carrying the specific technical lessons of miniaturized, ruggedized electronics under extreme physical stress directly into the aerospace and early computing industries that would define much of the following decades of American technological development. The proximity fuse program, in this sense, represents one of several wartime crash research efforts whose personnel and accumulated technical expertise seeded significant portions of the post-war American scientific and engineering establishment, a legacy that extended well beyond the specific weapon these individuals had originally been recruited to help develop. The broader legacy of the proximity fuse extended well beyond the Pacific War itself, establishing foundational principles in guided munitions technology that would directly inform artillery, missile, and precision-guided weapons development for decades following the war's end. A lineage running in an unbroken technical line from the miniaturized, shock-resistant radio components developed in wartime secrecy at Johns Hopkins through to far more sophisticated guided weapons systems that define modern military technology today. Historians of military technology studying this specific innovation have consistently identified it as one of the most consequential and least publicly recognized technical achievements to emerge from the entire Second World War. A piece of engineering that fundamentally altered the mathematics of anti-aircraft warfare at exactly the moment that mathematics mattered most. In the skies over a fleet facing waves of aircraft whose pilots had already decided their own survival was not part of the mission's calculation at all. What makes the proximity fuse's story particularly striking, set against the broader history of the Kamikaze campaign specifically, is the strange asymmetry it reveals in how differently the two sides approached the exact same tactical problem in the war's final year. Japan, facing a hopeless and worsening strategic position, responded by asking its pilots to accept a tactic built around their own deaths as the only remaining path to inflicting meaningful damage. The United States, facing exactly that same threat, arriving in ever greater numbers, responded by quietly perfecting a piece of technology that made every single gun on every ship measurably better at stopping those attacks before they could succeed, without asking a single additional American sailor to take on any additional personal risk to achieve it. Two nations, facing the same tactical problem in the same months of the same war, chose to solve it in ways that could not have been more fundamentally different, and the difference in those two approaches says as much about the industrial and scientific gap between the two combatants by 1945 as any single battle statistic from the war's final year ever could. Remember the question this story opened with: how do you explain, as a pilot or an intelligence officer, that the enemy's guns seem to have simply gotten better with no visible change at all? The honest answer, confirmed only in the decades after the war, once American wartime secrecy finally lifted enough for the full story to be told, is that Japan largely never did explain it correctly, not through any failure of individual Japanese analysts, but because the actual mechanism was, by design, built to be invisible from the outside, hidden inside a piece of ordnance smaller than a soup can, protected by a security apparatus specifically constructed to ensure that exact question would remain unanswered for as long as the war continued. If you want to understand how a piece of technology smaller than a soup can, developed in near-total secrecy and deployed with such caution that its own users often didn't fully understand what made it work, quietly turned the skies over the Pacific Fleet into a far more lethal place for kamikaze pilots who had no way of diagnosing what had actually changed. This is the story worth knowing in full. Subscribe to Pacific War Tales for more long-form World War II history from the Pacific Theater, told with the names, the dates, and the details intact.